Imagine a world where the pursuit of wealth and power reshaped entire continents, where human lives were treated as mere commodities, and where the thirst for dominance over distant lands fueled one of history's darkest chapters. The transatlantic slave trade was not simply a matter of economics, it was a complex web of ambition, prejudice, and human suffering that left an indelible mark on generations. Millions of Africans were uprooted from their homes, torn from their families, and transported across the ocean to labor in distant lands under brutal conditions. Their stories are often told through statistics, but behind each number lies a human life, a community disrupted, and a culture altered forever. European powers of the 15th and 16th centuries sought new avenues for trade and expansion. Motivated by the promise of wealth and the strategic advantage of global influence, they ventured into territories unknown to them, encountering diverse African societies rich in culture, knowledge, and resources. At first, trade focused on gold, ivory, and exotic goods, but soon the demand for labor in the colonies of the Americas transformed commerce into a devastating human enterprise. Pseudo-scientific ideas and distorted interpretations of religious texts were propagated to rationalize these actions, portraying Africans as inferior and thereby justifying the cruel system that would dominate centuries of transatlantic history. Yet the story is not only one of exploitation by European powers. The complexities of local politics, power struggles, and survival also played a role in shaping the trade. Some African leaders, navigating their own social and political landscapes, became involved in supplying captives, seeking alliances, protection, or access to valuable goods. This cooperation, whether motivated by necessity or ambition, illustrates the tangled realities of human decisions in extreme circumstances. As we explore this history, it is essential to remember the courage, resilience, and humanity of those who endured these hardships. Their strength in preserving culture, community, and hope under unimaginable conditions provides a vital lesson for us today. Understanding the origins and impacts of the transatlantic slave trade is not only a matter of historical curiosity, it is a key to comprehending the social, economic, and cultural legacies that still resonate across continents. In this video, we will uncover the stories behind the statistics, tracing the trade routes, examining the roles of African and European actors, and reflecting on the enduring effects on societies on both sides of the Atlantic. Join us on this journey to see history through the eyes of those who lived it, to witness the resilience of communities, and to gain insight into how past choices have shaped the present. If you find this exploration meaningful, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with friends and family. By supporting the channel, you help bring these important stories to light, ensuring that the lessons of history are not forgotten. As European explorers and traders expanded their reach across the coasts of West Africa, they brought with them not only goods and ambitions, but also a worldview deeply colored by centuries of prejudice and misunderstanding. A worldview that would be used to justify some of the most grievous injustices in human history. Among the arguments presented to rationalize the subjugation and commodification of millions of African people was a deeply distorted interpretation of religious texts, most famously the so-called Curse of Ham. According to this misreading of Scripture, Ham, one of Noah's sons, had been cursed, and it was believed that his descendants erroneously associated with African peoples were destined to servitude. This misrepresentation, used repeatedly by theologians and scholars of the time, provided a convenient moral veneer for the enslavement of entire communities, allowing those who benefited from the trade to claim divine sanction for acts that were, at their core, acts of profound exploitation. The notion of a divine justification transformed what should have been an unequivocal moral wrong into a topic of debate, enabling centuries of exploitation to persist under the guise of religious propriety and moral obligation. Alongside these religious arguments, Europeans increasingly turned to so-called scientific reasoning to support their claims of racial hierarchy, developing theories that would later be identified as pseudoscience. Craniometry, the study of skull shapes and sizes. And phrenology, the belief that the contours of the skull could reveal intellectual and moral character, were among the tools employed to assert the supposed inferiority of African peoples. These studies, often conducted with biased methodology and selective interpretation, created the illusion of objective evidence for a system that was already socially, economically, and politically motivated. Scholars and merchants alike used these assertions to create a narrative that framed slavery not as a moral failure, but as a natural order of the world, a framework in which European domination and African subjugation were seen as inevitable, even beneficial. In reality, these so-called scientific justifications were carefully constructed to uphold economic interests, reinforcing the transatlantic slave trade as a profitable and socially acceptable institution while masking the cruelty and suffering at its heart. The interplay of distorted religious beliefs and pseudo-scientific reasoning was not merely abstract. It seeped into the daily operations of the trade and into the minds of those who participated in it, shaping decisions, alliances, and conflicts. European powers, while negotiating with African leaders or establishing fortified trading posts along the coast, carried these convictions as a lens through which they interpreted encounters and assessed human value. African leaders, in turn, navigated this landscape with their own ambitions, understanding that European perceptions and prejudices could be manipulated for political advantage, access to weapons, or trade goods. The combination of religious distortion and pseudo-science created a framework that allowed a massive and complex system of enslavement to take root, one that was simultaneously ideological, economic, and logistical. As this framework spread, it had far-reaching consequences, influencing not only the immediate practices of enslavement but also the broader cultural and social dynamics of both Europe and Africa. Within European societies, these narratives reinforced existing hierarchies and fostered a sense of moral and intellectual superiority, while in African societies, they contributed to the ways in which alliances and rivalries were formed, sometimes intensifying conflicts that led to the capture and sale of fellow Africans. The psychological impact on both sides of the Atlantic was profound. Those enslaved were dehumanized not only by physical force but by a pervasive ideology that denied their dignity and worth, while those complicit in or profiting from the trade could rationalize their actions as being sanctioned by religion or validated by science. Yet even as these beliefs were widely propagated, the reality of African humanity, culture, and resilience could not be erased, despite centuries of manipulation, oppression, and dehumanization. African societies maintained their identities, adapted to challenges, and resisted subjugation in countless ways. The curse of Ham and the so-called scientific measurements could not capture the depth of creativity, intelligence, and community that defined these societies. Even within the brutal system of the transatlantic slave trade, the enduring strength, ingenuity, and courage of those affected became evident in stories of survival, resistance, and cultural preservation. These acts of resilience reveal the limitations of ideology and pseudoscience. No amount of distortion or false reasoning can extinguish the human spirit or erase the complexity of lived experience. As we trace this history, it becomes clear that the marriage of distorted belief and pseudo-scientific reasoning did more than justify slavery. It shaped a world in which power, wealth, and prejudice were intertwined, creating structures whose effects are still felt today. Understanding these justifications is crucial, not to dwell on blame alone, but to recognize the mechanisms through which societies rationalize injustice, to see how ideas can be weaponized to dehumanize, and to learn how narratives, whether religious or scientific, can be manipulated to serve the interests of a few at the expense of many. By examining the ideologies that underpinned the transatlantic slave trade, we gain insight not only into the past, but into the ways in which belief systems and social narratives can influence human behavior on a massive scale, reminding us of the importance of critical thinking, empathy, and historical awareness in shaping a more just and informed future. As the 15th century unfolded, European nations, driven by insatiable curiosity, ambition, and the promise of untold wealth, turned their eyes toward the coasts of West Africa, a region teeming with diverse cultures, natural resources, and intricate societies that had flourished for centuries. The Portuguese, under the guidance of visionary figures such as Prince Henry the Navigator and seasoned explorers like Vasco da Gama, spearheaded these early voyages, seeking new trade routes that could bypass established Mediterranean and Middle Eastern channels controlled by powerful empires. Their initial goals were rooted in commerce. Gold, ivory, and exotic spices represented not only material wealth, but also the keys to influence and status in an increasingly competitive European world. Coastal trading posts began to sprout along the shores, where Europeans and African merchants exchanged goods, forging relationships that were as complex as they were unprecedented. Textiles, metal tools, and decorative items flowed toward African markets, while gold, ivory, and rare commodities traveled back to Europe, enriching kingdoms and fueling further exploration. These encounters, though primarily transactional at first, exposed Europeans to the richness of African civilizations, revealing cities, kingdoms, and networks that were far more sophisticated than the simplistic notions of savagery or inferiority that some would later adopt to rationalize enslavement. Yet, as European ambitions expanded, the contours of commerce began to shift. The discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus and the subsequent establishment of colonies in the Americas created an entirely new dynamic, one that Europe had not fully anticipated. The settlers and colonial administrators in these distant lands confronted a severe labor shortage, caused in part by the devastating impact of European diseases on indigenous populations and by the harsh realities of plantation agriculture. Sugar, tobacco, and later cotton required intense, sustained labor, and the promise of wealth from these crops was staggering, creating an urgent and insatiable demand for a workforce that could endure grueling conditions and long hours under the tropical sun. European powers, recognizing the scale of opportunity and profit, began to look beyond traditional trade in commodities toward a darker, more human-centered enterprise, the capture and transport of African people to serve as forced laborers in the Americas. What had begun as a network of commerce in gold and ivory gradually transformed into a system built on human suffering, exploitation, and coercion, with devastating consequences for African societies. In West Africa, the initial reactions to European traders were cautious yet curious. As communities assessed both the potential benefits and the risks of these new encounters, African leaders understood the value of European goods, especially firearms, which offered a decisive advantage in local conflicts and power struggles. They navigated these early relationships with a keen sense of strategy, weighing trade and diplomacy against emerging threats. However, as the demand for labor in the Americas grew, European powers began to exploit these local ambitions and rivalries, offering not just goods but also alliances and influence in return for captives. What might have started as mutual commerce became entangled with coercion and pressure, drawing African leaders into an expanding network of raids, warfare, and negotiations that supplied European ships with people to transport across the Atlantic. These dynamics were not uniform. Some communities resisted fiercely, while others engaged in the trade selectively, seeking to leverage the new realities for survival, wealth, or political advantage. In either case, the consequences were profound. Reshaping societies, destabilizing regions, and altering the trajectories of countless lives. The shift from trading commodities to trading people was neither instantaneous nor inevitable, but emerged as part of a confluence of European greed, colonial ambition, and local political calculation. Explorers who had once marveled at African cities and markets began to see not only resources, but also opportunities to secure human labor for transatlantic plantations. The coasts that had been dotted with trading posts now became points of departure for the forced transport of millions, linking African societies directly to the brutal economies of the New World. This transformation was facilitated by the very systems of exchange, diplomacy, and rivalry that had characterized African societies for centuries. Yet it imposed unprecedented pressure and introduced new forms of violence, coercion, and social disruption. Amidst these sweeping changes, the resilience and ingenuity of African societies remained evident. Communities adapted to shifting alliances, navigated the complexities of European demands, and sought to preserve their cultural identities even as the fabric of daily life was torn by raids and forced displacement. The stories of leaders and ordinary people navigating these treacherous waters reveal a nuanced picture, a world in which ambition, survival, and morality intersected in ways that were rarely simple or clear-cut. Europeans, armed with distorted religious justifications and pseudo-scientific rationales for superiority, exploited both opportunity and misunderstanding. But they encountered a continent that was far from passive. Knowledge of terrain, local conditions, and social networks gave African societies tools to resist, negotiate, and, in some cases, shape the terms of engagement with foreign powers. Understanding this evolution from trade in gold, ivory, and spices to the capture and commodification of human lives is essential to grasping the complexity of the transatlantic slave trade. It reminds us that history is rarely linear or simplistic. It is shaped by economic ambitions, cultural encounters, human choices, and the unpredictable consequences that arise when disparate societies meet under unequal circumstances. This story of commerce turned coercion illustrates both the creativity and resilience of African societies and the devastating impact of European expansion, setting the stage for centuries of upheaval that would leave deep and lasting scars on the continent and its people. By tracing these early explorations and the shifting motives behind them, we gain insight not only into historical events but also into the enduring consequences of how trade, ambition, and human exploitation can intersect across cultures and continents. When Europeans first set foot on the shores of the Americas, they encountered landscapes of staggering beauty and promise. Yet they also faced realities far harsher than any maps or explorers' tales had prepared them for. Realities that would shape the course of history for centuries. The promise of fertile land and abundant resources was shadowed by the immense challenge of sustaining labor for the colonies they were rapidly establishing. As disease, unfamiliar climates, and grueling agricultural demands quickly decimated indigenous populations who had no immunity to new pathogens brought by the newcomers. Smallpox, measles, and other illnesses spread like wildfire, claiming the lives of countless men, women, and children, while the unfamiliar terrain and harsh working conditions on sugar, tobacco, and later cotton plantations made survival a daily struggle even for those who resisted disease. As native populations dwindled, European settlers faced an urgent crisis. The wealth of the colonies depended on labor-intensive crops. Yet the hands available to cultivate them were disappearing at an alarming rate. It was within this context that the transatlantic slave trade escalated from a commercial venture into a vast system of human exploitation. As European powers turned their gaze across the Atlantic toward Africa, seeking a workforce that could sustain the economic ambitions of the New World. The Americas, vast and tamed, presented both opportunity and peril, and the labor shortages were not merely logistical problems, they were existential threats to the prosperity of the colonies. Plantation owners, administrators, and investors realized that without a steady and controllable labor force, the enormous investments in land, equipment, and infrastructure could not yield the immense profits they envisioned. Indigenous communities, already devastated by disease and conflict, were unable to provide the workforce required for the increasingly ambitious agricultural enterprises. The solution, as European powers saw it, lay in the forced migration of African peoples, whose physical endurance, agricultural knowledge, and geographic distance from the colonies made them, in the eyes of colonists, an ideal source of labor. What had begun as exploratory trade and occasional enslavement gradually evolved into a highly organized system, one that would carry millions of Africans across the ocean and transform the demographic, economic, and social landscapes of the Americas. This shift was not simply a matter of replacing one workforce with another. It represented a profound transformation in the nature of the colonial enterprise. Europeans, having established footholds along the West African coast, were able to engage with local leaders and trading networks, exchanging firearms, textiles, and other goods for captives who were often the victims of intertribal conflicts, raids, or coercion. The logistical infrastructure of the transatlantic trade, including fortified ports, shipping fleets, and complex commercial arrangements, enabled a steady flow of people to meet the insatiable labor demands of the Americas. These operations were vast and meticulously organized, reflecting the lengths to which European powers would go to secure economic dominance and maintain the productivity of the colonies, all while attempting to rationalize their actions through distorted religious and pseudo-scientific ideologies that framed the subjugation of human beings as acceptable, even natural. The human cost of this labor system was staggering. Families were torn apart, communities destabilized, and entire regions depopulated as people were uprooted from their homes and sent to distant lands where they faced grueling labor, harsh punishment, and the constant threat of disease. The social and cultural fabric of both the sending and receiving regions was irrevocably altered. In Africa, the trade-fueled conflict shifted power dynamics and introduced European weaponry and goods that intensified rivalries among kingdoms and communities. In the Americas, the influx of enslaved Africans created new cultural landscapes. As traditions, languages, and knowledge systems were transplanted, often under duress, shaping the emerging societies of the New World in ways that would resonate for generations. The labor shortage, while initially a practical challenge for European colonists, thus became the catalyst for one of the largest and most devastating forced migrations in human history, connecting continents through a system of exploitation that would leave lasting scars on both sides of the Atlantic. Yet, even amidst the brutality and upheaval, the resilience and agency of African peoples persisted. Despite being forcibly uprooted, enslaved individuals maintained cultural practices, found ways to communicate, preserve traditions, and support one another under unimaginable circumstances. Their knowledge, endurance, and adaptation played a crucial role in sustaining the labor systems Europeans relied upon, while also planting seeds of resistance, cultural survival, and eventual social transformation in the colonies. The labor shortages of the Americas, devastating as they were, cannot be understood solely in terms of economics. They must also be viewed through the lens of human endurance, adaptation, and the ethical complexities of a world in which profit was prioritized over life. Understanding the connection between the labor shortages in the Americas and the rise of the transatlantic slave trade illuminates the intricate interplay of disease, environment, economic ambition, and human exploitation. It reveals how circumstances that may have seemed purely logistical to European settlers were, in fact, embedded in a broader system of oppression, power, and inequality that drew upon both local and transcontinental forces. By examining these dynamics, we gain insight into how European colonial expansion, coupled with the catastrophic impact of disease on indigenous populations, directly contributed to the systematic enslavement of African peoples, shaping the history, culture, and demographics of the Americas for centuries to come. The story of labor shortages, then, is not just a story of economic necessity. It is a story of human endurance, the exploitation of opportunity, and the profound consequences that arise when societies prioritize profit over humanity, leaving lessons that resonate far beyond the plantations and ports of the New World. As European ships pushed further into the intricate coastlines and rivers of West Africa, they often found that the riches they sought were guarded not only by natural barriers but by the ingenuity, courage, and strategic acumen of the people who had lived in these lands for generations. African communities, with their intimate knowledge of the terrain, the patterns of rivers and forests, and the rhythms of seasons and climate, were far from passive observers of European incursions. They understood the stakes. The arrival of foreign traders could bring wealth and goods, but it also carried the looming threat of violence, coercion, and the forced removal of their neighbors and kin. From fortified settlements to hidden pathways through dense forests, from ambushes timed to the patterns of tides to defensive strategies honed over centuries of intertribal conflict, these communities employed a rich repertoire of tactics to protect themselves from capture and enslavement. Knowledge of the land was weaponized in a way that European technology alone could not easily overcome, and the resilience of these communities slowed, complicated, and in some cases temporarily thwarted the ambitions of the burgeoning transatlantic slave trade. The initial encounters between European explorers and African communities were often tense negotiations, marked by cautious diplomacy, mutual curiosity, and an undercurrent of mistrust. African leaders assessed the intentions of the newcomers, weighing potential benefits against the clear dangers. Alliances were sometimes formed, but they were carefully calculated, as leaders sought to protect their people while gaining access to European goods, particularly firearms, which could tilt local power balances in their favor. Yet, as the demand for labor in the Americas intensified, European traders increasingly applied pressure, seeking captives to meet the insatiable needs of plantations across the ocean. In response, African communities relied on both adaptation and defiance, employing their environmental knowledge to create natural fortifications, anticipate movements of foreign ships, and exploit weaknesses in European formations. Dense forests, treacherous rivers, and the ever-present threat of tropical diseases all became elements of defense, illustrating that the struggle against capture was not only physical but also deeply strategic, rooted in an understanding of both nature and human behavior. This resistance took many forms. In some regions, communities conducted organized defensive campaigns, drawing upon local military traditions and social cohesion to repel raiding parties. Leaders mobilized warriors with knowledge of the terrain, using tactics that allowed smaller forces to outmaneuver better-armed Europeans, striking swiftly and retreating into areas where pursuit was difficult or impossible. In other cases, villages adopted subtler strategies, such as relocating populations, creating decoys, or negotiating carefully to delay or redirect European efforts. The resilience was not merely tactical. It was psychological, cultural, and social. as communities sought to maintain cohesion and morale even in the face of an increasingly brutal trade network. Knowledge of local flora and fauna allowed communities to exploit natural resources for sustenance and defense, and the ability to navigate the climate whether by timing movements during rainy seasons or utilizing heat and humidity to hinder unfamiliar troops provided significant advantages. Each of these strategies demonstrated a profound understanding of the interconnectedness of environment, society, and survival. European traders, while armed with firearms, ships, and navigational tools, were often unprepared for the complexities of the African interior. Disease, unpredictable weather, and the sophisticated defensive strategies of local communities frustrated attempts at easy capture. Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British expeditions frequently found themselves negotiating, bribing, or even retreating when faced with resistance that could not be overcome by technology alone. These interactions reveal a more nuanced narrative than one of simple European domination. African societies were active participants in shaping the outcomes of early encounters, using knowledge and strategy to protect their people and assert agency even within a system designed to exploit them. Resistance was not only a moral response but also a practical one, aimed at survival and the preservation of culture. Social networks, and political autonomy in the face of overwhelming external pressures. The consequences of these defensive measures were significant. They forced European traders to adapt their methods, often turning to alliances with certain leaders or communities to circumvent resistance elsewhere. They also highlighted the interconnectedness of African societies. As information, strategies, and support networks spread across regions, allowing communities to anticipate and respond to threats with increasing sophistication. However, the persistence of European demand and the enticement of firearms, textiles, and other goods eventually led some African leaders to participate in the trade, leveraging their knowledge and networks to supply captives in exchange for political and economic advantage. Even in these cases, the tension between collaboration and resistance reflected the broader struggle of African societies to navigate the pressures imposed by a rapidly globalizing and increasingly exploitative world. Stories of resistance echo through the historical record, illustrating the agency, courage, and resourcefulness of African communities in the face of profound danger. They remind us that the transatlantic slave trade was not a simple story of conquest, but a complex interaction of power, survival, and human ingenuity. Villages that successfully evaded capture, warriors who used the land to their advantage, and leaders who negotiated with skill and foresight all contributed to a legacy of resilience that challenges narratives of victimhood alone. These acts of defiance and adaptation also underscore the limitations of European power. Technology and ambition alone could not erase local knowledge. Communal cohesion, or strategic thinking. By examining how African communities resisted capture using their environment, understanding of climate, and sophisticated defense strategies, we gain a deeper appreciation of the human dimension of the transatlantic slave trade. These stories reveal the interplay between geography, culture, and human determination, illustrating that even in the face of overwhelming pressure, communities exercised agency, protected their people, and maintained a sense of autonomy. Resistance was not always sufficient to prevent loss, but it shaped the contours of the trade, influenced European tactics, and left a legacy of resilience that would endure across generations, reminding us that history is shaped not only by the forces of oppression but also by the courage, ingenuity, and perseverance of those who fight to preserve their humanity. As European traders entrenched themselves along the West African coast, the dynamic of power and commerce within the region began to shift in ways that would have profound and lasting consequences for centuries. Initially arriving with the promise of trade in gold, ivory, and spices, The Europeans soon discovered that the key to securing a steady supply of captives lay not only in their own ships and weapons, but in the alliances they could forge with African leaders. Recognizing the advantages of cultivating local partnerships, European merchants began offering a range of coveted goods in exchange for human captives. And among these, firearms became the most transformative. Guns, previously absent or rare in many regions, conferred significant military advantage, allowing rulers to expand their territories, defend against rivals, and assert dominance in ways previously impossible. Alongside firearms, textiles, metal tools, and alcohol were used as incentives, embedding European influence deep into the social and political fabric of West African societies and creating a network economic interdependence that tied local leaders' ambitions directly to the transatlantic slave trade. The introduction of European goods reshaped local politics, often exacerbating pre-existing rivalries and igniting new conflicts. Kingdoms and communities that once operated under relatively balanced power dynamics now found themselves in a competitive arms race, where access to firearms determined survival and influence. Leaders who accepted European goods and participated in the slave trade gained immediate material advantages but also became entangled in a system that demanded ever-increasing supplies of captives. To meet this demand, some African rulers launched raids against neighboring villages, often targeting communities with whom they had long-standing disputes or whose strategic locations promised abundant captives. Wars became more frequent and more brutal, fueled by a desire for European commodities as much as territorial ambition. These intertribal conflicts were no longer merely local power struggles. They were linked to an expanding global economy in which human lives had become a tradable currency, and success or survival was often measured in captives delivered to European traders. The social consequences of these conflicts were devastating. Families were torn apart, entire communities destabilized, and populations displaced, creating waves of human suffering that rippled across regions. Children, elders, and adults alike were caught in the maelstrom of raids and warfare, many ending up bound for the coast and shipment across the Atlantic. The influx of European goods, while materially enriching some leaders, imposed an ethical and practical burden that fractured the social cohesion of African societies. Alliances became transactional and fragile. Trust eroded, and traditional systems of governance were challenged by the pressures of accommodating European demands. Chiefs and kings faced difficult choices. To resist the lure of firearms and trade goods meant vulnerability to rivals, while participation ensured short-term advantage at the cost of destabilizing the very communities they ruled. Among the most notorious examples of this dynamic were kingdoms such as the Congo, the Asante, the Dahomey, and the where rulers skillfully navigated European incentives to consolidate power and wealth. King Afonso of the Congo initially sought to establish mutually beneficial trade relations with the Portuguese. But the exponential growth in European demand for labor gradually shifted his kingdom's focus from trade in gold and ivory to the capture and sale of human beings, reshaping social hierarchies and economic priorities. Similarly, the Asante Empire under leaders like Ose Tutu and Ose Bonsu leveraged European firearms and textiles to assert dominance over neighboring communities, orchestrating military campaigns and slave raids that not only expanded the empire but also cemented its central role in the transatlantic trade. The Dahomey Kingdom, renowned for its disciplined military and elite all-female warrior corps, also capitalized on European incentives, using firearms and strategic alliances to capture vast numbers of people from surrounding communities. These leaders, navigating a complex landscape of opportunity and coercion, illustrate how European goods directly influence the strategies, conflicts, and fortunes of African polities, linking local ambitions to global commerce in ways that were both transformative and catastrophic. The moral and cultural consequences of these developments were profound. Communities that once thrived on interdependent social networks found themselves at the mercy of raids and forced displacements, altering patterns of kinship, governance, and cultural transmission. Traditional rituals, ceremonies, and leadership structures were disrupted or co-opted to serve the demands of a trade that valued human beings as commodities. As European goods permeated societies, they reshaped aspirations, power structures, and even the perception of success, creating a feedback loop in which the accumulation of captives became both a marker of prestige and a survival strategy. Leaders who once measured influence by wisdom, lineage, or social contribution now measured it in terms of military capacity and ability to meet European demand, embedding the slave trade into the core logic of political life. Even as these incentives drove participation in the trade, resistance persisted in subtle and overt ways. Communities developed strategies to evade capture, hide vulnerable members, and negotiate with traders to minimize losses, demonstrating that African societies were neither passive victims nor uniformly complicit. Yet the combination of European weaponry, economic enticement, and local rivalries created an environment in which large-scale participation in the trade became increasingly difficult to avoid without significant political and military risk. The result was a tragic cycle. European goods fueled intertribal conflict. Conflict generated captives for trade, and the profits and weapons from trade perpetuated further conflicts, embedding the transatlantic slave trade deeply into African political and economic systems. Understanding the role of European incentives in shaping African participation in the slave trade illuminates the complexity of human agency, power, and morality in historical context. It reveals a world in which economic ambition, strategic calculation, and survival intertwined, producing outcomes that were both catastrophic and transformative. Leaders wielded European weapons and goods to consolidate power and protect their interests. Yet the same tools that brought short-term advantage contributed to long-term instability, social upheaval, and the suffering of millions. By tracing the flow of European incentives and their consequences, we see how global demand reshaped local societies, intensified conflicts, and perpetuated a system in which human lives became the currency of ambition, leaving a legacy that continues to resonate in historical memory and cultural consciousness across continents. Throughout the turbulent centuries of the transatlantic slave trade, certain African kingdoms and leaders emerged as pivotal actors, navigating a complex web of power, commerce, and survival, their decisions shaping both local realities and global history in profound ways. In Central Africa, the Congo Kingdom under King Afonso I stands out as an emblem of the delicate balance between cooperation and coercion, opportunity and tragedy. Afonso, a ruler educated in European ways and familiar with Christian doctrine, initially sought to foster mutually beneficial trade with Portuguese explorers, exchanging ivory, copper, and other resources for textiles, metal tools, and firearms. Yet as the European appetite for labor in the Americas escalated, so too did the pressure on Afonso to supply captives, a demand that gradually transformed the kingdom's political, social, and economic priorities. Afonso's correspondence with the Portuguese king reveals a ruler torn between maintaining sovereignty, protecting his people, and navigating the relentless demands of an emerging global trade network, ultimately illustrating the entanglement of local authority with European expansionist ambitions. Far to the west, the Asante Empire, rising to prominence in what is now Ghana, similarly exemplified the entwining of military ambition, economic incentive, and European influence. Osei Tutu, a visionary leader, laid the foundations for a centralized state by uniting a coalition of Asante-speaking communities under a shared political and cultural framework, establishing a monarchy capable of coordinated administration and sustained military campaigns. Though Tutu's reign preceded the peak of the transatlantic trade, His consolidation of power and creation of administrative infrastructures set the stage for subsequent engagement with European traders, particularly under the rule of Ozzy Bonsu in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Bonsu's leadership coincided with heightened demand for enslaved Africans, and he orchestrated military campaigns that captured prisoners from neighboring communities, including the Fant and various Akan subgroups, selling them to European merchants in exchange for firearms, textiles, and other sought-after goods. These exchanges amplified the empire's wealth and regional dominance, but also entrenched cycles of violence and social disruption, highlighting the morally complex terrain in which African rulers operated. Equally consequential was the Dahomey Kingdom, located in the region of modern-day Benin, whose participation in the slave trade became notorious for both its scale and the intensity of its military campaigns. King Gazo, ruling from 1818 to 1858, oversaw an era in which the kingdom's economy became heavily dependent on the capture and sale of enslaved Africans. Dahomey developed a highly organized system for conducting raids, detaining captives, and coordinating trade with European merchants, establishing itself as a crucial supplier within the Transatlantic network. The kingdom's all-female military corps, often referred to as the Dahomey Amazons, played a central role in these operations, showcasing a disciplined and formidable fighting force capable of executing complex campaigns that expanded the kingdom's territorial reach and maximized the flow of captives. Yet the Dahomey example underscores a duality. European demand and local ambition were mutually reinforcing, yet both came at the cost of destabilizing neighboring societies, disrupting families, and embedding cycles of violence into the regional landscape. In the Yoruba-dominated Oyo Empire of southwestern Nigeria, similar dynamics played out as well, reflecting a convergence of military sophistication, political centralization, and participation in the broader trade network. The Oyo military, known for its discipline and strategic prowess, conducted campaigns aimed at acquiring captives from neighboring regions, including the Igbo and other groups, supplying them to European traders along the coast. The empire's rulers leveraged European firearms and trade goods to consolidate internal power and project influence outward, transforming warfare and diplomacy alike. Here again, the interplay between local agency and global demand created conditions in which military expansion, economic opportunity, and social disruption were intertwined, demonstrating the multi-layered consequences of African engagement in the slave trade. Among the Igbo people, the Aro Confederacy emerged as a highly organized system mediating the capture and sale of enslaved Africans from the interior to European trading posts along the coast. Centered around the city of Aruku, the Aro Confederacy leveraged networks of allies, kinship ties, and established trade routes to facilitate the movement of captives, accumulating wealth and power in the process. While the Igbo and Aro were deeply impacted by European demands suffering depopulation, social disruption, and internal conflict, they also exercised agency in the trade, negotiating terms, organizing raids, and acting as intermediaries in ways that illustrate the complexity of local participation. The Confederacy's engagement demonstrates that the transatlantic trade was not merely an external imposition, but a system shaped by African strategies, ambitions, and socio-political structures. Together, these African actors, Afonso in the Congo, Zitutu and Ozzy Bonsu in the Asante Empire, King Gazo in Dahomey, the rulers of Oyo, and the Aro Confederacy, illustrate the diversity and nuance of African involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. Each kingdom, leader, and confederacy faced distinct circumstances, blending considerations of survival, ambition, trade, and diplomacy, and each navigated the opportunities and perils presented by European expansion in ways that had lasting consequences for their societies and the broader region. Their participation did not negate resistance elsewhere, nor did it represent monolithic complicity, but it reveals the difficult moral and strategic choices faced by African rulers under the pressures of a globalized economy increasingly defined by human exploitation. Understanding these key players allows us to appreciate the interconnectedness of local and global histories, highlighting how African societies were active participants, sometimes as reluctant collaborators, sometimes as ambitious strategists in shaping the trajectory of the transatlantic slave trade. Their stories underscore the complex interplay of power, commerce, and human agency, showing that the historical landscape of slavery was constructed not solely by European ambition but through the entangled decisions, alliances, and conflicts of multiple actors, each navigating the challenges and possibilities of a rapidly changing world. The consequences of African involvement in the transatlantic slave trade rippled through societies with devastating force, reshaping the social, political, and cultural landscapes in ways that would leave deep and lasting scars on the continent. Communities that had once thrived on tightly woven kinship networks, local traditions, and shared governance suddenly found themselves destabilized as the demand for captives intensified and local rulers aligned themselves with European traders to secure firearms, textiles, and other goods that promised wealth and protection. The capture of men, women, and children for trade not only depleted populations but also severed the social bonds that underpinned daily life, disrupting the transmission of cultural knowledge, rituals, and leadership practices that had sustained generations. Villages were abandoned, families fractured, and entire regions depopulated as raids and warfare became more frequent, often fueled by a combination of European incentive and intertribal rivalry, creating a cycle in which violence begot further violence, and instability became the norm rather than the exception. The demographic consequences were staggering. Certain regions saw dramatic declines in population, weakening local economies, reducing agricultural productivity, and limiting the ability of communities to resist further incursions. The loss of young and able-bodied individuals, who were often targeted for enslavement, left communities vulnerable not only to external threats but also to internal decline, as the balance between labor, leadership, and social cohesion was upset. Elders, children, and those less able to flee became the custodians of culture, struggling to preserve knowledge and traditions in the face of repeated disruption. While the networks that had once allowed for collective decision-making and mutual aid were fractured under the pressure of sustained raids and the lure of European trade goods, in many cases, local governance systems were co-opted or undermined, as leaders who aligned with European merchants gained access to weapons and wealth, creating hierarchies that prioritized the capture and sale of human beings over the welfare of their communities. The social upheaval extended beyond immediate depopulation. Entire communities experienced trauma that reverberated across generations, as the memory of family members captured, sold, or killed shaped collective identity and social cohesion. Rituals of mourning, remembrance, and reconciliation were challenged by the scale and frequency of losses, leaving cultural practices strained under the weight of grief and disruption. Moreover, the introduction of European goods created new social expectations and dependencies, as access to firearms, textiles, and other commodities became markers of status and power, incentivizing continued participation in a trade that undermined traditional norms and moral frameworks. These dynamics compounded the destabilization of communities, embedding cycles of conflict and exploitation into the very fabric of African societies, and reshaping the political and economic incentives that governed local life. Warfare and raids became institutionalized as methods for securing captives, often involving organized armies or coalitions of towns and villages working under the directives of local rulers who sought to maintain favor with European traders. This militarization altered long-standing patterns of diplomacy and negotiation, as previously stable alliances dissolved under the pressure of competition for resources and captives. The proliferation of firearms, introduced through European trade, further escalated violence, making conflicts more deadly and widening the scale of destruction, leaving once prosperous regions vulnerable to repeated attacks and sustained depopulation. Traditional mechanisms for conflict resolution, rooted in communal discussion, mediation, and ritualized negotiation, struggled to contain the intensity and frequency of hostilities, accelerating the erosion of social cohesion and the breakdown of established authority structures. The cultural impact of these upheavals was equally profound. Language, religious practices, artistic expression, and customary law all faced pressures from repeated population loss and the imposition of European influence. Communities that had long maintained distinct cultural identities found themselves fragmented, with surviving members dispersed or forced to adapt under the conditions of European-dominated trade networks. The disruption of generational knowledge transmission, combined with the imposition of foreign values and goods, contributed to a sense of cultural dislocation, as elders struggled to pass on traditions while younger generations faced a world transformed by violence, commerce, and the constant threat of capture. In many cases, these changes undermined communal resilience, eroded social trust, and reshaped local hierarchies in ways that made long-term recovery more difficult. Economically, the destabilization of African communities altered production, trade, and resource allocation, as labor shortages, raids, and warfare disrupted agriculture, craft production, and local commerce. Surviving communities often became dependent on European goods and trade networks, further entangling them in systems that prioritized the extraction of human beings and commodities over sustainable local development. The flow of captives from interior regions to coastal trading posts created economic incentives that incentivized continued conflict and raids, embedding the slave trade into the operational logic of regional economies and transforming political priorities in ways that favored short-term gain over long-term stability. Despite the overwhelming challenges, resistance persisted in multiple forms. Communities developed strategies to protect themselves, hide vulnerable members, and negotiate terms with European traders to mitigate losses, demonstrating resilience and agency even under extreme duress. Yet, the structural pressures created by European demand, local political ambition, and intertribal rivalry meant that complete avoidance of participation in the trade was often impossible, and the long-term consequences of depopulation, social fragmentation, and cultural disruption were felt across generations. These upheavals were not merely the product of external imposition, but the result of complex interactions between local agency, global commerce, and shifting power dynamics, illustrating the intertwined nature of African and European histories during this period. In examining the widespread social upheaval caused by African involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, one sees a tapestry of human resilience and tragedy, ambition and moral complexity. Communities were destabilized, populations depleted, and traditional structures challenged. Yet within these struggles, individuals and groups demonstrated agency, ingenuity, and persistence, striving to navigate a world transformed by violence, commerce, and coercion. The legacy of these upheavals continues to inform contemporary understanding of African history, culture, and society, underscoring the profound and enduring impact of the transatlantic slave trade on the continent's demographic, social, and cultural landscape. The transatlantic slave trade, while devastating in its immediate human cost, also laid the groundwork for a far-reaching transformation of Africa's political, economic, and cultural landscape, setting the stage for a period of European colonization that would extend well into the 19th and 20th centuries. The extraction of millions of Africans over several centuries not only depopulated regions and disrupted local societies, but also weakened the structural integrity of kingdoms and communities, creating a vulnerability that European powers would later exploit with precision and force. Coastal forts and trading posts, initially established to facilitate the purchase of enslaved individuals, gradually evolved into administrative centers for colonial control, as European empires recognized the strategic advantage of dominating territories that had already been destabilized by centuries of internal and external conflict fueled by the slave trade. By the time the scramble for Africa commenced in the late 19th century, many African states were weakened economically, socially, and militarily, making it easier for colonial powers to impose authority, redraw borders, and establish extractive systems with minimal resistance. Economic exploitation became one of the defining features of this era. Regions that had once engaged in localized agriculture, artisanal production, and interregional trade were systematically reoriented to serve the demands of European industrial growth. Raw materials, including minerals, timber, and cash crop, were extracted on a massive scale, often with little to no fair compensation for local populations. Labor shortages, initially caused by the slave trade, were compounded by colonial demands, as men and women were conscripted into forced labor systems to sustain mining operations. Plantations, and infrastructural projects designed primarily for the enrichment of foreign powers. The economic architecture imposed by European colonizers mirrored the patterns established during the slave trade. Regions became dependent on external markets. Internal production was redirected toward export rather than local sustenance, and traditional economic autonomy was eroded. Local communities, already struggling with the demographic and social consequences of centuries of slave raids, found themselves further marginalized, with their labor, land, and resources co-opted to fuel European industrial ambitions. Cultural suppression accompanied these economic and political pressures. Colonial authorities, often justified under the guise of civilizing missions, sought to replace indigenous languages, religious practices, and governance systems with European norms, legal codes, and Christian institutions. The disruption initiated by the slave trade had already weakened many traditional structures, making the imposition of foreign cultural models more feasible and often more rapidly effective. Schools, religious missions, and administrative institutions became instruments of assimilation, shaping new generations according to European ideals while devaluing local knowledge. Oral traditions, and customary law, even artistic and ritual expressions, which had once served as markers of communal identity and resilience, were marginalized, as colonial priorities emphasized economic production and political compliance over the preservation of cultural heritage. The legacy of this suppression created enduring tensions between modern state structures introduced by colonizers and traditional authorities, often leaving post-colonial nations grappling with questions of identity, legitimacy, and cultural continuity. Politically, the combination of the slave trade and subsequent colonization disrupted long-standing systems of governance and introduced new dynamics of instability. Leaders who had once exercised authority within well-defined kinship networks and territorial boundaries now confronted the dual pressures of European expansion and local rivalries amplified by the trade in human beings. European-imposed borders frequently ignored existing ethnic, linguistic, and cultural divisions, forcing diverse groups into artificially constructed administrative units, while splitting some communities across multiple colonial territories. The result was a fracturing of political cohesion that would reverberate for generations, contributing to post-colonial challenges including ethnic conflict, competition for resources, and struggles over national identity and governance. By destabilizing pre-existing political systems, the combination of slave trading and colonial administration created conditions in which external control was normalized, local authority was undermined, and the seeds of long-term political tension were sown. The intersection of these forces: demographic depletion, economic extraction, cultural suppression, and political reorganization, illustrates how the legacy of the slave trade extended far beyond the immediate horrors of human bondage. European powers, having benefited from centuries of forced labor and wealth accumulation, turned their attention to consolidating control over Africa itself, exploiting the very fractures that had been exacerbated by local collaboration and conflict. Indigenous societies faced the compounded challenges of rebuilding after generations of population loss, navigating foreign-imposed economic structures, and attempting to preserve cultural identity under the weight of new colonial ideologies. Resistance persisted, from armed uprisings to subtle acts of cultural preservation. But the structural pressures imposed by external and internal forces created an environment in which maintaining sovereignty, social cohesion, and economic independence became extraordinarily difficult. This historical trajectory demonstrates that the transatlantic slave trade was not an isolated atrocity but a catalyst that reshaped the African continent in ways that would reverberate across centuries. The extraction of human capital weakened societies, introduced new forms of violence and competition, and created dependencies that made subsequent colonization both easier and more destructive. Economic systems were reoriented toward external exploitation, cultural practices were marginalized, and political structures were fragmented, leaving a legacy of instability and underdevelopment that would challenge post-colonial nations long after formal independence was achieved. Yet within this narrative, the resilience of African communities remains evident, as people adapted, resisted, and preserved elements of identity despite the enormous pressures imposed by centuries of disruption. Ultimately, understanding how the slave trade set the stage for colonization and long-term exploitation allows us to see the intricate connections between human suffering, economic ambition, and the restructuring of entire societies. The story of Africa during this period is one of intertwined tragedy and resilience, where the echoes of the past continue to inform present challenges and aspirations, highlighting the profound consequences of global trade, local decision-making, and the enduring human drive to survive, adapt, and assert identity amidst profound upheaval. As we come to the close of this exploration into one of history's most painful and complex chapters, it is essential to recognize that the transatlantic slave trade was not solely a story of European exploitation, but also a story of African involvement, choices, and consequences that reshaped the continent in profound ways. Understanding the complicity of certain African leaders and communities does not serve to diminish the immense suffering inflicted by European powers, nor does it excuse the cruelty of the slave trade. Rather, it illuminates the intricate dynamics of human behavior, the intersection of survival, ambition, and coercion, and the ways in which systemic pressures can distort moral decision-making. Leaders like King Afonso of the Congo, Zibonsu of the Asante Empire, and King Gazo of Dahomey operated within political and economic frameworks that were deeply entangled with European demand for human labor. Their decisions, influenced by access to firearms, trade goods, and strategic advantage over rival communities, highlight how local and global forces converged to sustain a system that wrought devastation upon millions. These actions had far-reaching and long-lasting consequences. Social structures were disrupted as communities were depopulated and families torn apart, with cultural knowledge and practices fragmented under the pressure of repeated raids and forced migrations. Economically, regions that had once enjoyed relative autonomy became dependent on the exchange of human lives for European goods. embedding patterns of extraction and dependency that would echo through subsequent generations. Politically, intertribal conflicts intensified, traditional leadership hierarchies were undermined, and territories that had once been cohesive were destabilized, laying the groundwork for vulnerability to later colonization. Even as we recount these historical realities, it is crucial to remember that within these tragedies, countless acts of resilience, negotiation, and survival also occurred, revealing the profound capacity of human communities to adapt, resist, and endure under extreme duress. By examining African complicity, we confront the uncomfortable truth that human history is rarely black and white. It is a tapestry woven from the threads of ambition, survival, morality, and coercion, where individuals and groups navigate complex ethical landscapes under conditions often shaped by forces far beyond their control. The transatlantic slave trade exemplifies this complexity, showing that oppression can be both externally imposed and internally facilitated, and that the consequences of such systems reverberate across time, influencing social, economic, and cultural trajectories for centuries. Recognizing this reality fosters a more nuanced understanding of history, one that moves beyond simplistic narratives of victims and perpetrators, and instead examines the interlocking systems, decisions, and consequences that shaped human experience. In reflecting on these dynamics, we also gain insight into the broader lessons that history offers for the present. The trade reminds us of the dangers inherent in dehumanizing ideologies, the consequences of placing profit and power above human dignity, and the ways in which collaboration, whether voluntary or coerced, can perpetuate cycles of harm. At the same time, it highlights the resilience and agency of communities, emphasizing that even in contexts of extreme exploitation and violence, people have sought to protect their families, preserve their cultures, and resist oppression. These lessons are not merely academic. They inform contemporary conversations about justice, reconciliation, and the long-term impacts of systemic inequality, urging us to remain vigilant against modern forms of exploitation, marginalization, and moral compromise. As we close this story, let us carry forward both the memory of the immense suffering endured and the acknowledgement of human agency in all its complexity. Understanding the interplay between complicity and coercion allows us to appreciate the full scope of historical forces and encourages a reflective, compassionate engagement with the past. It is a call to remember the individuals whose lives were altered irrevocably, to honor the resilience of those who endured, and to recognize the enduring impact of historical systems on contemporary societies. This awareness empowers us to build a future informed by history, one that values human dignity, ethical responsibility, and the recognition of interconnected human experiences across time and space. Thank you so much for joining me in this journey through history. Your attention, curiosity, and willingness to engage with challenging topics mean a great deal. And if you found this exploration insightful, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who might benefit from understanding these complex historical realities. By supporting this channel, you help ensure that stories of the past are told with nuance, care, and a commitment to truth,